I remember the exact moment the door closed behind me, and the fluorescent lights of the ER seemed to grow harsher, colder, as though they were stripping me before anyone even laid a hand on me. My body felt heavy, unstable, as if I had been pulled out of myself and placed into a space where I no longer had control. I was led to the narrow bed in the examination room, paper sheet crackling beneath me, and I sat with trembling fingers clutching at the edges of my clothing. My chest rose and fell too quickly, each breath shallow and uneven, not only from illness, but from a creeping anticipation that unsettled me. The nurse approached, her expression professional, her movements efficient, and yet there was something in the air between us that seemed to thrum with an unspoken charge. She told me I needed to undress for examination. Her hands reached toward the buttons of my blouse, not rough, not invasive, but deliberate, like there was no room for refusal. The sound of each button slipping free was louder than it should have been, echoing in my ears, syncing with the pounding of my pulse. I sat still, feeling the fabric slide down my shoulders, leaving my skin exposed to the cool air of the room. Goosebumps spread across my arms, but the warmth of her fingers where they brushed my collarbone left a trail that contradicted the chill. My body resisted the vulnerability, but at the same time it leaned into it, as though some hidden part of me had been waiting for this exact unraveling. When she lifted the stethoscope to my chest, the cold metal pressed against bare skin, and I shivered involuntarily. The touch was supposed to be clinical, but it felt different, heavier, more personal. I felt her hand steady the instrument, fingertips grazing the curve of my breast, and my heart seemed to pound harder, as though announcing itself directly into her palm. I wondered if she could feel the quickened rhythm, if she recognized the way my body was responding. My breath caught in my throat, not just from the pressure on my lungs, but from the awareness of how deeply she was inside my space. The removal of my clothes continued slowly, layer by layer, until I was reduced to the thin hospital gown. It was flimsy, almost translucent, doing nothing to shield me from her gaze or my own sense of exposure. The fabric gaped at the sides, falling open too easily whenever I moved. I became acutely aware of every inch of skin that might be visible to her, of the way the gown shifted when I lifted my arms, of how fragile the barrier was between us. I tried to hold the edges closed, but my fingers were clumsy, and her hands were quicker, adjusting the gown, sliding it from one side to the other in the name of examination. She leaned close, her face hovering inches from mine as she checked my eyes with a small light. The glow illuminated her features, softened them, and for a moment I forgot the sterile walls and the faint hum of machines. Her scent reached me, clean soap mixed with something faintly floral, and I inhaled it without meaning to. The beam shifted across my pupils, but all I could focus on was the closeness of her body and the steadiness of her breath. The examination had nothing to do with desire, yet every second of it felt like an unveiling, as though she was seeing not just my body, but something beneath it. When her hands moved to check my abdomen, pressing firmly against my stomach, I felt the heat of her palms through the flimsy gown. The pressure was steady, almost soothing, and yet the intimacy of it sent sparks racing beneath my skin. Each place she touched lingered long after her fingers moved on, leaving behind an imprint that grew heavier with time. I clenched my jaw to keep from betraying the tremor in my voice, but my body betrayed me in other ways. A subtle arching of my back, a tightening of my thighs, a sharp intake of breath when her touch slid closer to the edge of fabric. She did not react, at least not outwardly, but I wondered if she noticed the shift in my breathing, the flush creeping across my chest. I sat there, half hidden, half exposed, and realized that the act of being undressed was no longer simply about necessity. It was a ritual of surrender, a stripping away not just of fabric, but of distance, of defenses I had spent years constructing. Her hands, her eyes, her presence dissolved those barriers with disarming ease. I felt caught between fear and fascination, between the sterile reason for being there and the dangerous undercurrent pulling me toward something else. The room seemed smaller, the silence thicker, and every movement carried the weight of possibilities I was not yet ready to name. In that moment, as her fingers adjusted the fabric one final time and she stepped back to assess me, I realized I was trembling, not from illness, but from the rawness of being seen. My body was no longer only mine. It had been laid open under her gaze, her touch, her authority. And in that strange, disorienting space, I understood that nothing about this examination felt ordinary. It was the beginning of something I could not stop, even if I had wanted to. The hours that followed stretched out like an endless ribbon, marked not by the clock on the wall, but by the sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor outside my room. The ER was a place where chaos usually reigned, but inside my small cubicle, the world slowed to a strange rhythm. I could hear voices, bursts of urgency, and the beeping of machines from somewhere down the hall, but within these thin curtains, there was only the steady hum of fluorescent light above me. I lay back on the bed, trying to calm the restless tremor that still lingered in my body after the examination. Every shift of the paper beneath me made me feel raw, as if the thin layer separating me from the mattress carried the memory of her hands. She came back more often than I expected. At first, I thought it was just part of her duty, a nurse checking on a patient who needed monitoring. But the pattern grew noticeable. She didn't just appear to take my vitals or adjust the monitors. She lingered. Her presence filled the space in a way that was almost tangible, like warmth radiating from a hidden source. Each time she entered, the air grew heavier, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. She would stand close, not close enough to break any rule, but close enough that the outline of her figure burned itself into my awareness. When she touched me again, checking my pulse or adjusting the cuff on my arm, her fingers pressed lightly, deliberately steady. The pressure wasn't just medical. It carried something quieter, something that made the blood rush faster beneath her fingertips. I tried to keep my face neutral, but my body betrayed me. My hand twitched slightly under her grip. My chest rose too quickly. My skin prickled where she brushed against it. I wondered if she noticed, or if she chose not to acknowledge the small betrayals of my composure. I kept searching her expression for any sign, but her face remained calm, professional, unreadable, and that restraint only deepened the tension. The more she returned, the more I began to anticipate her visits. The sound of approaching steps in the hallway sent my heart racing, my body tightening with expectation. When it wasn't her, I felt a sharp pang of disappointment, quickly hidden beneath a mask of indifference. But when it was her, everything inside me shifted. I followed her with my eyes as she moved around the room, charting notes, adjusting equipment, or simply standing by the bed with her clipboard. The fluorescent lights caught strands of her hair, and I noticed how they glowed faintly, how the curve of her jaw seemed sharper under the shadows. I told myself to stop staring, but it was impossible. My eyes wandered, tracing the way her uniform fit across her body, the subtle movements of her hands, the way her lips pressed together when she concentrated. Every detail took on a new significance. Even the way she leaned slightly on one hip while writing felt like an invitation. I tried to look away, to find distraction in the sterile walls or the dull hum of machines, but my attention always returned to her. It was magnetic, a pull that I could neither resist nor explain. The silences grew heavier each time. She no longer needed to say much when she entered. The quiet between us seemed to have its own language. I felt it in the way her eyes met mine and held just a moment too long. I felt it in the way she adjusted my blanket, her fingers brushing lightly against my wrist before pulling away. It was nothing anyone else would notice, nothing that would stand out to a passerby. But to me, those moments were louder than the chaos outside. They were small sparks that refused to die, gathering slowly into something larger. When she checked my breathing with the stethoscope again, the cold disc pressed against my chest, but it was the warmth of her hand holding it that left a mark. I felt her knuckles graze the side of my breast as she adjusted the angle, and the jolt of sensation made me shift against the paper-covered bed. My body betrayed me again, arching ever so slightly, my breath catching audibly in my throat. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw her lips curve, the smallest trace of acknowledgement, before her expression settled back into composure. That almost smile haunted me long after she left the room. Time lost its shape as the night wore on. I lay awake, half ill, half alert, waiting for the sound of her return. My body buzzed with restless energy, unable to distinguish between fever and desire. Every time the curtain rustled and she stepped inside, I felt both relief and dread, as though the very act of her presence pushed me closer to some inevitable edge. I could not decide whether I wanted her to cross it or whether I feared what might happen if she did. But as her shadow fell across me again and again, I realized that part of me no longer cared about consequences. All I knew was that she kept coming back, and each visit drew me further into a place where the boundaries of care and craving blurred beyond recognition. The quiet of the night settled like a veil over the room, muting the sounds of the busy ward outside. The fluorescent lights were dimmed, leaving only a muted glow from the hallway filtering through the cracks in the curtain. I sat on the edge of the bed, the thin gown draped loosely over my shoulders, and felt my pulse race in anticipation of something I couldn't name. My skin was hypersensitive, every draft of air against it magnified, every beat of my heart heavy. The memory of her hands from earlier lingered on me, as though my body carried an imprint that would not fade. When she returned, her presence filled the room before I even turned my head to see her. She moved with the same calm efficiency as before, clipboard in hand, but there was something different in her silence. She asked nothing, offered no explanation for why she was back again, and yet I felt a tremor of awareness settle between us. She set the clipboard down, adjusted the curtain so it closed more securely, and then stood too close, the space between us taut with unspoken meaning. My breath shortened, and though my body ached with exhaustion, a deeper hunger pushed through the fatigue. She told me she needed to examine me once more, her tone smooth, neutral, the words nothing but procedure. But when her fingers reached for the tie of my gown, it felt less like duty and more like a deliberate trespass. The fabric loosened and slipped aside, revealing the line of my collarbone, the curve of my shoulder, the swell of my breast. Her knuckles grazed my skin as she adjusted the stethoscope, lingering longer than necessary, as if testing how much she could take without breaking the illusion of professionalism. I sat motionless, my hands clutching the edge of the bed, every nerve alive with the risk of surrender. Her hand slid down my rib cage, pressing gently into my abdomen to check for tenderness, but the pressure was softer than before, more measured, almost curious. I felt the heat of her palm seep into me, spreading lower until my body tensed with expectation. My thighs shifted restlessly under the gown, the paper sheet crinkling beneath me, loud in the silence. She did not comment, did not look up, but her movements slowed, deliberate in a way that betrayed her awareness. It was no longer just an examination. It was an unspoken invitation. I kept my eyes fixed on her face, searching for cracks in her composure. She did not meet my gaze directly, but the stillness in her features seemed practiced, controlled. Yet there was a subtle tremor in her breath, a hesitation that gave her away. When her hand brushed just above my hip, the gown slipping open wider, I felt a surge of heat spread through my body, sharp and undeniable. My lips parted to steady my breathing, but the sound that escaped was closer to a sigh, heavy with want. The silence grew thick, oppressive, alive with tension neither of us could dissolve. My body betrayed me, arching slightly into her touch, thighs pressing together as though to contain the ache building inside me. She finally looked at me, her eyes steady, but charged with a weight I could no longer mistake for detachment. For a long moment, we stayed suspended in that gaze, bound by the knowledge of what was happening. The examination had become temptation, and temptation had already become something more. Her fingers finally left my skin, retreating slowly as she adjusted the gown back into place. But the gesture felt hollow, as though both of us knew it was too late to undo what had already been set in motion. I sat there trembling, caught between fear of what we had crossed into and hunger for more of it. The room felt smaller now, suffocating in its intimacy, and my body throbbed with the memory of her hands. I knew, with terrifying certainty, that the next time she reached for me, I would not have the strength or the desire to resist. The room felt sealed off from the rest of the world, as if the sterile curtains and white walls had become the borders of a secret we both silently agreed to protect. The usual chaos of the ER seemed to vanish. Even the machines outside hummed more quietly, like they were respecting what was about to unfold. I could hear my own breathing, uneven and shallow, rising above the faint rustle of her movements. When she closed the door and lowered the blinds, I felt a wave of anticipation ripple through me, a mixture of fear and longing that made my body restless against the thin sheet beneath me. It was no longer about being treated. It was about being touched in a way I had both dreaded and secretly craved. Her fingers brushed against my arm as she leaned closer, pretending to adjust the edge of the gown. The fabric shifted and fell away from my shoulder, exposing the line of my skin. Her knuckles grazed the curve of my collarbone, and the warmth of that brief contact sent a tremor through me. I felt suspended, my body caught between surrender and resistance, but I did not move to stop her. Instead, I allowed the silence to guide us deeper into this forbidden space, where every touch became amplified, every second stretched unbearably long. She pressed her hand lightly against my chest, feeling the rise and fall of my breathing. The cold stethoscope that had been there before was gone. Now it was only her palm, her skin against mine. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain she could feel it vibrating under her hand. She didn't withdraw. She lingered, her fingers spreading slightly, her thumb brushing the curve of my breast through the thin material of the gown. The touch was subtle but undeniable, and my body leaned into it instinctively, betraying how deeply I wanted more. When her lips finally touched my shoulder, I felt my control begin to unravel. The kiss was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried an intensity that reached far beneath my skin. Her breath warmed the delicate space between my neck and collarbone, and I shivered, not from cold, but from the way my body awakened under her mouth. Each kiss traveled lower, tracing a path that made my pulse race faster, my thighs tighten involuntarily. I gripped the edge of the bed with both hands, desperate to ground myself, but it only emphasized how completely I was losing control. The gown slipped further open as she moved, and I made no effort to pull it back. Her hands glided across my stomach, pressing gently, almost reverently, as if committing every curve to memory. The sensation of her touch was both soothing and consuming, a blend of care and desire that blurred all boundaries. I felt her fingers brush against the side of my hip, tracing lines that set my nerves on fire. My body arched subtly, seeking more of her, aching for a contact that went beyond the surface. Her lips found my chest, and when her mouth closed around the sensitive skin, I gasped, unable to contain the sound. Heat spread through me in waves, flooding my senses, drowning out every rational thought. I threaded my fingers through her hair without thinking, pulling her closer, urging her silently to continue. Her tongue traced patterns across my skin, each movement deliberate, each pause calculated to make me quiver. It was no longer just temptation, it was surrender, pure and complete, and I let myself fall into it without hesitation. As her hand slid down my thigh, parting the gown completely, I felt a surge of vulnerability sharper than anything before. But alongside the fear came exhilaration, the knowledge that I was being touched, seen, wanted in ways I had never allowed. Her fingertips trailed upwards slowly, teasingly, until they reached the place where my body ached the most. The first contact was light, barely there, but it made me moan softly, a sound that seemed to fill the room. I could no longer disguise what I wanted. My body spoke more clearly than words ever could. The rhythm of her touch deepened, deliberate and knowing, and I gave in fully. My back arched, my breath caught in frantic bursts, and every nerve in me reached for her. She guided me carefully, skillfully, as if she had memorized the map of my body long before this night. The crescendo built slowly, unbearably, until I shattered against her hand, trembling uncontrollably, gasping for air as if I had surfaced from drowning. She held me firmly, grounding me, her presence steady, even as I fell apart. In the aftermath, I lay sprawled against the sheets, skin flushed, gown completely undone. She rested beside me, her hand still on my stomach, her head close enough that I could feel her breath against my skin. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy, alive with what had just taken place. I stared at the ceiling, chest rising and falling, and knew there was no return to what we had been before. Something irrevocable had been written onto my body, into my memory, and it pulsed there with every beat of my heart. The night did not end with that first unraveling. I thought perhaps the intensity of what happened would leave us both shaken into distance, but instead it drew us closer, binding us to the inevitability of repeating what had already begun. The air in the room felt thick with the memory of her mouth, her hands, the tremor of my own release. My body still tingled, restless and open, unable to forget how she had taken me apart so carefully, piece by piece. When she shifted beside me, her presence was not clinical, not restrained, but lingering, deliberate, as though she too carried the same need coursing under her skin. Her hand slid across my stomach, fingers drawing absent shapes against my damp skin. The gown lay discarded, and there was no pretense of modesty left between us. I felt her weight settle beside me, the warmth of her body aligning with mine. Her lips brushed my temple, then the edge of my jaw, a trail that felt like a quiet command. I turned toward her instinctively, my chest rising to meet hers, our breaths colliding in the dimly lit space. What began as a tender reassurance grew into something heavier, deeper, impossible to resist. I reached for her this time. My fingers found the fabric of her uniform, tugging it loose, desperate to strip away the barrier that had kept me from her skin. The zipper gave way, the material sliding open, revealing the contours I had only imagined until now. Her bra fell away easily under my hands, and I cupped the weight of her breasts, marveling at the way her body arched into my touch. Her moan was low, barely audible, but it sent a shiver through me, proof that she was no longer in control either. I kissed her chest slowly, savoring every gasp, every tremor, until her composure fractured. When she lowered herself onto me, her body pressed flush against mine. I felt our heat merge into something raw and consuming. My hands slid down her back, tracing the strong curve of her spine, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. The sheets tangled around our legs as we moved together, not hurried, but desperate in rhythm. Her hips shifted against mine, friction building with each roll, each thrust, until I cried out, gripping her tighter, craving the sensation to never end. The sound of our breathing filled the small room, drowning out everything else. I wanted to give her what she had given me. My hands slid down, fingers finding their way beneath the waistband of her underwear. She trembled the moment I touched her, a sharp intake of breath against my neck. She was slick, ready, her body responding with urgency, and I moved carefully at first, savoring the way her muscles tightened beneath my touch. Her forehead pressed against mine, our breaths mingling, her moans vibrating into my mouth as I quickened the pace. Each shift of my fingers made her hips jerk, her nails dig into my shoulders, her composure unraveled further. She lost control in my arms, her body convulsing in waves as I held her close, guiding her through every trembling release. Her cries were muffled against my skin, but the sound of them etched into me like a brand, unforgettable and raw. I felt her collapse onto me afterward, her body heavy and warm, her heartbeat racing in sync with mine. I wrapped my arms around her, anchoring her, even as I lay trembling from the weight of everything we had shared. The scent of sweat, the taste of her lips, the feel of her skin, all of it fused into the air, staining the night with our secret. We stayed entangled, unwilling to break the spell. Her fingers traced lazy circles along my thigh, her breathing steadying as she drifted into a haze of exhaustion and satisfaction. I stared into the dim ceiling, overwhelmed by the knowledge that what we had done was no longer a single lapse, but a pattern forming, a rhythm we would fall into again and again. I knew then that this was not the end, nor even the climax, but only the continuation of something neither of us could stop. The repetition was inevitable, and I welcomed it, even as I felt the weight of its consequences looming beyond the fragile walls of that hospital room. The morning after felt unreal, as though I had crossed into a life I did not recognize, but could not escape. The sheets were tangled around my body, still carrying her scent, and the walls seemed to hold the echo of our sounds from the night before. My skin was marked with faint traces of her mouth, the warmth of her hands still lingering like a brand. I lay there for a long time, waiting for her to reappear, expecting the door to open, but the silence stretched on. The absence of her presence filled the room more loudly than her touch ever had. When I finally rose, my body ached in places I didn't know could ache, not with sickness but with memory. I pulled the gown around me and walked barefoot across the cold tile floor, searching for her. The hallway outside was empty, eerily calm after the chaos of the night. I asked no questions aloud. I only listened for the sound of her footsteps, the ones that had haunted me through every hour. But there was nothing, just the distant beeping of machines, the sterile hum of the building, and the hollow space where she should have been. On the small table beside my bed, I found the envelope. It was thin, almost careless, as though it had been left in haste. My name was written on it in her handwriting, sharp and deliberate. I opened it with trembling hands, expecting words of confession, maybe even an apology. But what I found inside was colder, stranger, and far more permanent. It was not a letter at all. It was a document, official and stamped, naming me as her emergency contact, her next of kin, the person listed as closest to her in the world. I stared at the paper, confusion tightening in my chest. I tried to make sense of it, tried to understand how she could take me in one night and then leave me marked, not only on my body, but inside her life, carved into her records as though I belonged there. My name was etched into her existence in a way I had not chosen, and the weight of it pressed against me harder than her touch ever had. It was a gesture that felt intimate, but also unsettling, almost grotesque in its sudden finality. I sat on the bed, clutching the document, my mind spiraling through every possibility. Had she planned this from the beginning? Was I just another patient she had turned into something else, binding me not only in flesh but in paperwork, bureaucracy, permanence? The thought made my stomach twist, yet a part of me felt a strange rush of exhilaration. She had claimed me in a way no one else ever had, not with words, not with promises, but with ink and signature, placing me into her life with an authority that could not easily be undone. The memory of her mouth between my thighs, her breath against my skin, blurred together with the sight of my name on the page. Desire and dread fused until I could no longer separate them. It was not just that she had touched me, it was that she had branded me, written me into her story without asking, made me responsible for a life I barely understood. I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling both violated and chosen, cherished and trapped. The contradiction pulsed inside me, ugly and intoxicating, a truth I could not deny. When I finally left the hospital, the sunlight outside felt harsh, too bright, almost mocking. I carried the document folded in my bag, its weight far heavier than its size. My body was still hers, even in absence. My name was still tethered to her, even in silence. I walked through the parking lot with trembling legs, realizing that what began with her taking off my clothes had ended with her taking something far deeper. She had taken the boundaries I thought I controlled and rewritten them in ways that felt both thrilling and obscene. That night, I lay in my own bed, but I could not sleep. I kept pulling the paper from the drawer, reading my name, seeing it tied to hers, feeling the permanence of it. My skin burned with memory, my mind spun with fear. But somewhere in the pit of me was a dark, undeniable hunger. I knew I would not escape her. I knew I didn't even want to. She had left me with something more lasting than touch, something I could never return. It was the kind of ending that was not closure at all, but an opening into a life that would always taste of her. Sweet, dangerous, and impossibly irreversible.